Welcome to The Quiet Truth, where lay Catholics learn about easing on down the road to hell. I'm Tom Borek with episode 28, Rationalizing a Commandment to Death. In our last episode, I admitted to waking up after 55 years of inattention to find that the third commandment I grew up with was being ignored and rationalized toward meaninglessness. As one measure of this change, I noted that the local branch of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, with the apparent support of the entire St. Louis archdiocesan hierarchy, had decided to hire people to sell furniture, clothing, and other items on Sundays. Since posting that episode, I've spoken with a number of devout, faith-filled Catholics who are perfectly comfortable with Sunday sales. I've learned that there are millions of such Catholics and millions of other Christians who agree with them. I've also spoken with people who, like me, thought Sunday sales were prohibited. How did this division come about? It was not the case in 1960. In 1960, Christians generally did not work, buy, or sell on the Lord's Day. They understood that this was the rule and had been the rule for nearly 2,000 years, and that the Jews had honored their Sabbath in this way for at least 1,500 years longer than that. The last words of the third commandment, quote, "The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work," unquote, meant don't work on the Lord's day. Don't build, don't plow, don't sell, don't buy, and don't do any other work, or let your servants or your employees do any either. An emergency exception was limited to genuine threats to life, limb, or property. You could fight off a wolf, bandage a wound, or put out a fire. A charitable exception was limited to volunteering one's own time performing works of mercy for people in need. You could feed a hungry person, nurse a sick person, or visit a prisoner. You absolutely could not hire someone to work for a charitable cause on Sunday. Knowingly violating this rule was a mortal sin. In nearly every U.S. jurisdiction, compliance with the rule was enforced by state and local governments through the so-called blue laws, which prohibited most Sunday work and had done so since colonial days. So, if you came of age prior to 1960, everything you had ever heard would have told you that Christians were not to perform unnecessary work on Sundays, and that Sunday sales were absolutely unacceptable. During the 1960s, the blue laws came under political attack. Some argued that they violated federal and state constitutions by furthering the interests of Christianity. Others favored the profitability and convenience of 7 weekly shopping days. Soon, in virtually all U.S. jurisdictions, these laws were repealed by the legislature, nullified by the courts, or ignored by law enforcement. As a result, retail stores began opening on Sundays and insisting that their employees work Sunday shifts. As each store or chain made the change, their Christian employees faced a choice: follow God's commandment or preserve their income. Now, the actual financial hardship facing individual employees varied widely. It might be as extreme as losing one's home and car, or it might be as mild as a $10 pay cut. Priests, untrained to deal with the crisis, provided guidance that was somewhat inconsistent. Some taught parishioners to follow God's commandment regardless of the consequences. Some were more lenient, especially with those facing severe economic threats. But they differed among themselves as to the severity of the threats required for leniency. Some priests told parishioners that due to their extreme circumstances, working on Sunday was not sinful at all. Others said that the sin could be forgiven. Some put conditions on the forgiveness, such as requiring confession of future instances of the sin or adherence to a specific plan to find Christian-friendly employment within a specified period of time. This inconsistent guidance led inevitably toward the normalizing of Sunday work and a weakening of teaching against it. People hear what they want to hear, and people facing even the mildest form of economic martyrdom want to hear that they can avoid it without penalty. Accordingly, upon hearing that any priest anywhere had allowed someone to perform Sunday work, the particular circumstances would be ignored, and the lesson learned would be the church allows it. As the laity became increasingly comfortable with this permissive attitude, so did the clergy. The entire process worked like a one-way ratchet. As exceptions were made, Sunday employment and Sunday purchasing only increased. So today, Christians are divided. In general, those who came of age prior to 1960 assume that Sunday sales are absolutely forbidden, while those who came of age after 1980 assume that Sunday sales do not present an important moral issue. These assumptions developed unconsciously or semi-consciously, based purely upon the cultural messages we picked up in our youth. If we haven't yet examined them consciously, we're not responsible for them. We deserve neither praise for getting them right, nor shame for getting them wrong. So now let's take a step back and consider which is more correct, the centuries-old no work rule or the newer work when you can think of a reason practice. The theological basis for the old rule is clear. It is part of the moral core of Judeo-Christianity revealed in God's Ten Commandments. It was and is an aid to our salvation. It helps people put aside their worldly concerns, build their lives around God, and tangibly demonstrate their commitment to the faith for the benefit of their children, their children's children, and all others within their sphere of influence. There is no good Christian argument for the new practice because there is no justification for sin. Deliberately, publicly, and repeatedly violating God's commandment is sin, and sin is not excused because avoiding it is difficult. That's the truth. The end. It's hard to accept for two reasons. First, because our secular culture drowns us in innumerable false and misleading ideas that predispose us to rationalize sin against the third commandment. And second, because separating ourselves from Sunday work seems unbearably difficult. In the remainder of this video, I'll highlight the foolish messages that lead to equally foolish rationalizations. In my next video, I'll describe an action plan easy enough for people like me who are terrified of economic hardship. The most thoughtful argument, that is, the most thoughtful, detailed rationalization for abandoning the old rule, is contained in a letter I received from the St. Vincent de Paul Society when I questioned its Sunday sales policy. Let's evaluate it in context. In my initial message to the Society's executive director, I quoted the Commandment and the current catechism to explain why I thought the thrift stores ought to be closed on Sundays. I'll spare you the details, but I concluded as follows, quote, I recognize that I'm swimming against the tide of modern trends. Nonetheless, I'm prepared to explain why I am 100% certain that the present teachings of the magisterium forbid running thrift stores, especially using hired help, on Sundays. I am further prepared to explain why the magisterium ought not to modernize its interpretation of the third commandment in order to ratify the widespread practice of treating Sunday as an ordinary shopping, selling, and working day. Of course, if necessary, I can also explain why we ought not to act contrary to current church teachings in hopes of some future change. The Society's Director of Vincentian Services responded as follows, quote, I understand your concerns regarding the operation of our thrift stores on Sundays in light of the third commandment as outlined in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It is evident that your perspective is grounded in a deep respect for the teachings of the magisterium and a genuine desire to align our actions with the principles of our faith. While I acknowledge and respect your interpretation of the current teachings on the observation of the Lord's Day, I would like to offer an alternative perspective, unquote. When I read that for the first time, I expected that her alternative perspective would be an alternative interpretation of current church teachings. It was not. I expected her to claim that my interpretation was wrong. She did not. I expected her to claim that thrift store sales fit within a recognized exception to the ban on Sunday work. She did not. By her silence, she admitted that her alternative perspective cannot be reconciled with the teachings of the Church, nor with Protestant Christianity. Instead, she listed three factors that she believes are more important than our obligation to keep the Lord's Day holy in the way he explicitly commanded. In other words, she argued for modifying God's moral law with a new and explicitly non-Christian set of priorities. As we examine these non-Christian priorities, notice how rationalizations for sin are superficially attractive and fundamentally foolish. The first factor she proposes to prioritize over the third commandment in its entirety is as follows, quote, the mission of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul is rooted in charitable work and service to those in need. Our thrift stores play a crucial role in generating funds to St. Vincent de Paul programs, and the revenue generated on Sundays contributes significantly to these endeavors, unquote. We are tempted to overvalue financial assistance to the poor because society tells us that enough such assistance will cure all or most of society's ills. Commitment to wealth transfers has become the secular culture's mono-virtue, exalted far above, for example, humility, chastity, and piety. It tempts us to accept any activity, even sinful activity, that serves this purpose. As Christians, we must assign charitable giving its proper priority. When done correctly, it is a corporal work of mercy that can reduce suffering temporarily. It is not, however, a cure for much of anything. It won't save donors or recipients from sin. It won't save them from illiteracy, unemployment, absent fathers, domestic violence, gang violence, drug alcohol addiction, sexual promiscuity, child abuse, or child neglect. And it won't induce them to care for their elderly or disabled relatives. In addition, it can have negative effects, enabling some people to shirk responsibility and repeatedly make bad decisions. Society also tells us that the invisible and intangible is less real and less important than the visible and tangible. We are vulnerable to this falsehood because what we experience directly through our senses is generally more vivid and memorable than our abstract knowledge of the spiritual world and our invisible God. Therefore, we quickly and easily perceive the tangible benefits of serving the poor, but not the intangible benefits of pursuing holiness. Society also tells us that the ends justify the means. We've come to expect our fictional heroes to lie, steal, and torture in pursuit of some greater goal. Selling on Sunday seems benign by contrast. Nonetheless, even in purely financial terms, the Society's Sunday sales decision was foolish, short-sighted, and ultimately counterproductive. A cleric, supportive of Sunday sales, described the Society's problem and the solution as follows, quote, "They had a large nest egg a decade back, but all of that has been used up by the needs of the nonprofit. Few people want the store open on Sunday, but they need the revenue, so a majority voted to have the store open on Sunday," unquote. So, he defines the problem as the absence of a large nest egg, which created a sin-shaped hole in Vincentian finances that cried out to be filled by Sunday sales, God's commandment notwithstanding. But this definition is foolish and misleading. The nest egg was not laid by a giant bird, and it did not disappear because of some one-time event. The egg was an accumulation of money donated by devout Catholics. And the root of the current problem was and is that financial donations are shrinking because the Catholic community itself is shrinking and becoming less devout. In other words, the Society's income has been affected by the same forces that are causing widespread parish closures. Just a few weeks ago, years after its Sunday sales decision, the Society announced that it would lay off several top executives, close a large facility, and eliminate a number of pickup bins in order to save money. Apparently, Sunday sales were not the answer because the one-time disappearance of a nest egg was not the problem. At least since the 1960s, the children of each succeeding generations of devout Catholics have been less devout than their parents. Some become atheists or agnostics, others reject more Christian doctrines, engage in more public sin, and or receive the sacraments less often than their parents. The St. Louis Archdiocese recently closed some 60% of its parishes, and a similar percentage closure is expected again in less than 30 years. The resulting loss of souls is a terrifying ongoing tragedy. So why is each generation moving further from the church and from salvation by every available measure? Can it be that 21st century Catholics are born with less virtue? I think not. Can it be that high-tech sin is irresistible in comparison to lower-tech sin that was available to prior generations? I think not. God would not leave modern children with a lesser chance of salvation than their ancestors. Even if some kinds of sin are more attractive now, we have compensatory resources, more leisure time, more available information, and a greater ability to understand the consequences of sin. Life is no less fair today than it was 1,000 years ago. The Old Testament histories provide an explanation. As a group, God's chosen people periodically moved away from God toward the false beliefs of their neighbors. Each time, after much suffering, they would repent and move toward holiness again. During the last 65 years or so, the Catholic community has tried to accommodate itself to its increasingly godless neighbors. Pressure from modernists has caused compromising of doctrine, as we do less and less preaching and teaching about less popular doctrines, and as more Catholics reject them. In addition, as a group, we've come to condone more and more kinds of sin. When a generation has compromised, that is, rejected, downplayed, or ignored part of God's truth, its children will nearly always compromise the same way, and will tend to believe that they, like their parents, have the right to reject any doctrine that makes them uncomfortable. Accordingly, they are likely to compromise even more than their elders did. Similarly, when a generation has condoned certain sinful behavior, its children will nearly always condone the same behavior and believe that they have the right to condone and rationalize away additional sins that particularly appeal to them. Accordingly, they are likely to condone even more sin than their elders. All of this brings us back to the society's plan to improve its financial condition by compromising doctrine and condoning sin against God's commandment. These actions, taken publicly by a Catholic society supported by the Archdiocese and named for a beloved saint, will surely accelerate the loss of faith among future generations, who will consequently provide less and less support for Christian charity. Like any sin or deal with the devil, the benefits are short-lived and the long-term consequences are horrible. As usual, the rationalization process that leads us from the near occasions of sin to actual sin makes us stupid. If that's too complicated, just remember, sin makes us stupid. All of which brings us to the second set of factors that the society wants us to value above seeking holiness in the way God commanded. Quote, "In addition, we know that our neighbors in need, needing our stores as a resource, turn to us on their available weekend hours. This includes both voucher clients and those looking for low-cost items sold in our stores to support their families." Unquote. This too is a foolish rationalization. In order to justify their Sunday sin, the society's leaders claim concern for a victim class composed of the poor and nearly poor people who work so much time and overtime Monday through Saturday that they can never shop between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. on those days, and who have no other adults in their households who can assist with shopping. The theory is that in the past, these people have been oppressed and impoverished by thrift store managers hard-hearted enough to honor the third commandment. I suppose the claim is that in the third millennium, the Society of St. Vincent, along with Payless Shoes and the Dollar Store, are expressing a more effective and sensitive kind of charity than the original St. Vincent could have imagined, the charity of low, low prices on Sunday. Like I've said, it's a foolish rationalization for sin. From 1609 to 1960, the Blue Laws and Christian customs within the territory that became the USA prevented Sunday sales, and no one was oppressed. Hardworking farm or factory laborers all managed to obtain furniture, clothes, and kitchen equipment. Today, members of the supposed victim class can purchase secondhand items 24 hours a day over the internet. Those with no funds at all, the voucher clients, can receive free items on Sundays from volunteers performing personal works of charity without pay. If no volunteers are available, and volunteers are certainly available, or if internet sales are too expensive for some, thrift stores can open early or late on a particular weekday. Wow, God's commandment is neither unworkable nor cruel. He doesn't make mistakes. Sinners do, and then they babble nonsense to justify themselves. Here's the third factor the society elevates above adherence to God's law. Quote, "The modern context presents unique challenges and opportunities for the church to engage with the world. While we must adhere to the core principles of our faith, we also discern how best to fulfill our mission in a rapidly changing society." Unquote. This rationalization doesn't even rise to the level of argument. It feeds our egos by implying that modern Christians face challenges so much more difficult than those of our ancestors that we can only prevail if we lighten our load by dropping unimportant and old-fashioned Christian principles as long as we retain the core ones. The truth is that there is no aspect of our modernity that calls for us to spend less time pursuing holiness. The fact that we wear pants does not make the third commandment obsolete. If anything, our high-tech society, with gigabytes of sin around every digital corner, cries out for more quiet time away from commerce and toil. Finally, the Ten Commandments, all 10 commandments, are the core moral principles of our faith. Discard any of them, and the Christian community itself may begin to collapse. Oh, wait, that's exactly what is happening. Our primary goal must be the salvation of souls. All else is secondary. If the society stands in the way of that goal, it is less than worthless. In summary, arguments against honoring the Lord's Day are stupid rationalizations for sin. Sin, as always, makes us stupid. In my next video, I'll make some suggestions for action, but I promise that I will not ask you to quit your job, nor will I tell you to tell your relatives or friends to quit their jobs. Coming soon, episode 29, The Lord's Day, passe or fixer-upper? Thank you for your kind attention.